13 participants.
All right, I've got 7 o'clock here on the dot. So let's get started. First of all, my name is Honora Rodriguez. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the South St. Paul Public Library. Thank you all so much for joining us for this presentation. We're happy to be celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. We have a lot of other celebrations that are going on, so go check those out on our website, ssplibrary.org. I ask that you all mute yourselves during the presentation, so mute your microphones. Questions that you may have during the presentation, you can just type into the chat, and I will go through those at the end and read some of those to Lois. Since we're talking about the history of this library and this city, it's especially important that we respectfully acknowledge that South St. Paul Library is located on the traditional and ancestral lands of Indigenous people. South St. Paul resides on land that has been inhabited by the Mdewakanton Dakota people, including the site of Kaposia Village. Seated in a land treaty signed in 1851, this land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, the Native nations and peoples of this region. So I'd also like to quickly read a little bit about Lois Glewwe, so that you can see all of the work she's done in this community and elsewhere. So Lois Glewwe was born and raised in South St. Paul, Minnesota, the daughter of Reuben and Ethel Heimers Glewwe. She graduated from South St. Paul High School and the University of Minnesota and received her master's degree in Southeast Asian Studies, Indian Art from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. She did postgraduate work in New Delhi, India for a year and returned to the States to work as the Rights and Productions Director and the Curator of Indian Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She came back to South St. Paul in October 1985 and was hired by the city of South St. Paul to plan and coordinate the city's centennial celebration in 1987. And by the South St. Paul chapter of the Dakota County Historical Society to produce the 528-page history of the city. We have many copies here at the library if you want to check that out. Lost my spot. Here we go. In 1989, she was hired to write the history of West St. Paul, 1889 to 1989. And in 1990, she was contracted by the city of Inver Grove Heights to write Inver Grove Heights, Minnesota's Treasure. Glewwe is also the author of The Glewwe Family History, published in 1999, the memoirs of George Schulte, published by the North American Baptist Heritage Commission in Sioux Falls, South Dakota in 2002, and The Journey of the Prisoners in Trail of Tears, Minnesota's Indian Exile Begins, published by Prairie Smoke Press in 2009. For the past several years, she has been studying the history of the Dakota Mission in Minnesota with special focus on Jane Williamson. She received an independent research fellowship from the Minnesota Historical Society in 2014 and continues her studies in the field today. And that is from this book. Oh, it's moving from my background, that we also have in the library that was written by Lois. So with that, I will turn the time over to Lois.
My goodness, I've been busy. When you read it all together like that, it sounds very impressive. Thank you very much, Honora. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight on this Zoom meeting, which is something we're getting used to, at least I am. And it's been very helpful during the pandemic to be able to see each other and visit and attend meetings and presentations like this, even though we aren't together in person. And I also, as Honora mentioned, Town Square Television is broadcasting this live tonight, right now, and it'll be available in the future, I'm sure, as well. I also should forewarn you a little bit. I share my home with cats, and cats love Zoom. So occasionally, in the middle of a meeting, one will jump on my lap and mess up the keyboard. I'm hoping that doesn't happen. Right now, they're all sleeping somewhere. So hopefully we'll have a peaceful hour and a half or so. I also should tell you a little bit about, I guess I would consider it a disclaimer. You know, the South St. Paul Library is very important to me personally. I literally grew up in the library. I can say that without hesitation. And so a lot of this, what I want to share tonight is personal memories of doing that in those years. And I apologize if it's more about me in those cases, but I think understanding how people interacted with the library over time is a very important part of its history and how important it is to the community. I also want to apologize to board members and staff members who are not included in the publication or in the presentation, not identified anyway. In 100 years, there's a lot of people who have worked here and been important members of the board, and it's just impossible to mention them all. So I've included a couple of highlights and some of the people that were around for a while that the community will remember, and we'll go through that throughout the presentation tonight. But first of all, we have to decide. I'm not moving. There we go. How you start a library. And so this was back in 1916. And South St. Paul Mayor Charles Clark was one of the most amazing entrepreneurs in the state of Minnesota, probably anywhere in the country. You know, he came here in 1886, started building up the foundry industry in the north part of town, what we call South Park. And he was the inventor and owner of the first electric monorail in the Midwest. That was the Bryant Hill monorail that went up Bryant Avenue to 16th. It made its first test run in 1888, and dignitaries were here from all over the world. He didn't have any luck joining up with the railroad tracks heading into St. Paul, so the monorail was never really in operation. But I like to think of it as the first light rail that Minnesota ever had, just about as successful as it is today. So that's one of his most famous inventions. He also was very interested in community culture. He came from Chicago, from South Park, which is the suburb of Chicago. And he was a well-educated and a very artistic, creative individual. And so he always wanted to improve the quality of life for people here in this community. And thus he decided we needed a public library. And he appointed that first library board in 1916. It really was a roster of who's who, and I just want to run through some of these folks for you. First of all was Otto J. Schumacher, who was president of Drovers Bank, which had been founded in 1912. Then there was the Carlson, who was a builder. He built so many things in town. Tons of his buildings are still being in use today. Maka Granis, we'll talk about a little more too. She was a very famous leader in the suffrage movement. Alderman and insurance agent George Kneffel was on the city council, or George Kramer was the mayor. And Father H.G. McCall of St. Augustine's represented the Catholic community. Patrick McConnon was on the council. And Patrick Amelia O'Keefe, the wife of the city attorney, was on that first board, as was Alderman John Schumacher. I want to point out that Otto Schumacher, who was the president of the board for many, many years, had started on that original board and was in the photo in 1922 and was killed in a tragic automobile accident in 1930. Leaving a young family and the whole community grieving for him because he was a very active person. So a lot of important names in that list. One of those was Maka Granis. And I talk about Maka because she was really responsible for so many things that were created in South St. Paul. She was the founder of the South St. Paul Study Club. She founded the South St. Paul chapter of the League of Women Voters. She was on the library board from 1916 to 1968, 52 years. and she served on the Dakota County Library Board from 1958 to 1968. She was a graduate of Luther College in Iowa, and she married her husband, David Granitz, there. He was an attorney. They had two boys, Vance and David, both of whom were attorneys, and still a very famous, well-known, prominent family in the area with several Granitzes serving in the law practice. But Maka had an image, I think, of South St. Paul where she really wanted, like Charles Clark, to create a mecca of culture in this community. And, it was a challenge. You have to think back to the 1920s. South St. Paul already had issued over 80 liquor licenses on Concord Street. Cows and cattle and livestock, sheep, pigs, hogs, everything came in every day. And there were over 800 acres of open livestock pens in the yards. The smell of manure in a hot August afternoon was pretty overwhelming. It was a challenging community when you started to talk about culture. And I think Maka addressed that very well. What was interesting though too is that it was very much a town of immigrants. Both Armours and Swiss sent representatives over to Central and Eastern Europe to recruit people to come and work in the plants, the meatpacking plants. Swift's had opened in 1895 and Armours in 1919, right after World War I. The difference about South St. Paul really was that single women could work here. They couldn't work in the mining industry on the Iron Range, but they could work here in the slaughterhouses and the packing plants. And so they could come here, be recruited, even coming over as a single woman. They could get a job, save their money. Often they did that and opened a dress shop or a little corner grocery store, or help their family come over and provide for them. And they gathered themselves in ethnic communities. I love this photo of the Serbian women on the left. Those are the Serbian mothers. And I can just imagine you didn't mess with them. They pretty much ran the Serbian community, I'm pretty sure. The photo on the right is obviously a publicity photo for Swift's. I don't think any young lady who worked in the meat trimming department would wear a pretty white blouse to work. So this was obviously a posed photo, but it does show us the kind of women that were working in the plants and how independent they were and how interested they were in becoming part of this community. Oftentimes when those immigrant women got here, they found a diverse community that was made up of immigrants from all over. And often the first place they lived would be one of these boarding houses down on Concord Street. There was probably one house where it was mostly Croatians, and there might be another that was Serbians, another that was Romanian, another for the people from Poland. So you'd check into the boarding house, hopefully finding a neighbor from even your home village who would help you find a job and help you start to learn English and get yourself acclimated to become part of this community. The other side of town were the people who'd come here many from out east or from bigger cities. These were the families of bankers and commission men and stockyards executives. And they built beautiful Victorian homes, usually in South Park or some in the center of town. And you'd think almost that there would have been a class divide between those two communities. But what was interesting is South St. Paul had one high school. So that meant as soon as your kids were old enough to go to high school, you went to school with children and classmates from all over the world whose last names had more vowels than you could possibly pronounce. And that's how they came to know each other. It was through schools, through the PTA, through those encounters. And it was because of that interaction that South St. Paul women became the first to vote on the morning of August 27th, 1920, when the morning after the 19th Amendment was ratified by Congress. We know that happened. It was well documented by newspapers from all over the country. And Fox Films was here from California. The Hearst newspapers covered it. A pretty amazing morning. And of course, Maka Grenis was one of the first women to vote on that meaningful morning. So I think this is kind of helps us set the atmosphere for what was happening. World War I didn't impact the city as economically you may think. Both meatpacking plants, the big ones, were operating all during the war. So South St. Paul continued to grow and thrive during the war. But it was things like a library board and fundraising that took a back seat during those years following of World War I and right following. But in 1922, that library board rented space in what was called the Fitzgerald Building, that's shown here. It was where Neighbors Inc. is today, right on that Neighbors Hill, next to the fire station. Just a small little storefront that had been the Ellsworth Confectionery store before that. And they opened with temporary librarians at first on December 1st, 1922. And the first librarian came, Miss Cornelia Plaister, started on February 1st, 1923. 115 books were taken out that first week, and 533 patrons had been registered as library participants by January 30th, 1923, after 2 months. All of the books at that point had been donated by people. There was, of course, an assortment of topics, both fiction and nonfiction. The city council put $2,500 in the budget to purchase books. So that was where they got started in actually buying books. And it was, excuse me, the first time people could take books home. The high school had a reading room where people could go before this to read books in the school, but you couldn't check them out. So this was the first time people could actually check out books. Excuse me, and they were limited to 2 books per time. So you couldn't have more than 2 books at once. Excuse me, so I'm gonna use coughing all night. So the board was establishing itself in the community and people were beginning to use it. There were 753 volumes checked out during the first month, and 2,000 in February of 1923. The library was open half days, sometimes in the morning and sometimes in the afternoon. The board itself began to focus on fundraising. They wanted to build their own library. And at the time, Andrew Carnegie was very active. And he had funded eventually construction of over 2,500 public libraries. And in 1916, oh, excuse me, the Carnegie Foundation pledged $10,000 to the South St. Paul Library Board. And the Stockyards Company donated 2 lots on the corner of Marie Avenue and 3rd Street North, where the library is today. So they were gradually making progress. But World War I came to slow things down. And unfortunately, Andrew Carnegie died in 1919, and the foundation carried on for 10 more years. But the South St. Paul Library Board was then notified in 1921 that they were withdrawing their 10,000 and would not be building a library in South St. Paul. I wanted to show a couple of Carnegie libraries though, because I think the library we ended up with has that same feeling of graciousness and entry and accessibility that our library ended up with. So this Carnegie Library on the left is in Akron, Ohio. And I didn't know this before, the Washington, D.C. Historical Society is actually located in a former Carnegie Library. in Washington, D.C., and that's pictured on the right. So then they went to the city council and asked for a $75,000 bond issue to build a new library. Pretty much everybody was involved with fundraising at one time or another, and this was their biggest effort to get the city on board. However, the election was held in June of 1923, and it was defeated by 132 votes. So once again, they were back at the starting ground for a new library. Cornelia Plaister left to take up position at a library in Seattle, Washington in 1925, and Grace Dorival came. Mrs. Grace in the first library in the Fitzgerald building, and she actually stayed until 1946, so a very long tenure. She was a professional librarian and was very much active in the community and spoke to a lot of clubs and organizations and promoted the library, and was very successful in her work. Some of the things that happened at that first library at the Fitzgerald building were the first year they had a circulation of over 25,800 books. Everybody was raising funds. As I mentioned, the Boy Scouts went door to door. I looked at the list of donors in the paper. It was interesting that most businesses and individuals only gave $1 each as their pledge to the new library. So it was going to take a long time to raise $75,000 at that rate. The library got its first telephone in February of 1923. That was the same year that a full set of the Encyclopedia Britannica was donated to the library. And then in January 1924, they expanded by moving into the tailor shop that was on the western side of the main floor of the Fitzgerald building. They took the wall down and created an arch entryway through the two sides. And the adult collection was moved to the western side of the building, and the kids were on the east side. They also had a reading room. They offered 35 magazines available and newspapers from all over. And oftentimes the commission men and stock drovers from the stockyards who were waiting for their commission to come through would come up and take some time to read magazines or just have a time of relaxation in the reading room. And in 1924, the library was given a radio. And so they would produce programs for women in the afternoons and musical evenings for the family on the radio. So lots of programming was going on. They also weren't the only library in town. The Polish National Alliance opened their library at the Polish Hall in 1923. They had over 500 volumes, most of them in Polish, donated by the National Polish Alliance in Chicago. And it was a very popular spot for that ethnic community, this is on First Avenue South. The hall itself is gone. The PNA, or the Polish National Alliance, took down their big hall and built a duplex, a smaller rental property. But the bar and entertainment space is still in the basement of the original Polish hall. The library, I'm afraid, is long gone. So we start to make some progress. The American Legion donated $500 for a new library in January of 26. That same year, the voters finally approved a bonding issue, but only for $25,000. Dakota County pledged $7,500 to build a new library. And the board decided to name the library the American Legion Memorial Library. The plans for the library were accepted from Thomas Ellerby and Company. They were the architects. The groundbreaking was held December 27th, 1926. And the building construction bid came in at $27,100 plus the plumbing and wiring. The cornerstone had been laid on February 21st, 1927, and dedication of the new library was held on November 11th, 1927, Veterans Day, which was appropriate. the American Legion was founded in South St. Paul after World War I, so they were a relatively new organization. They and the VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, began their recruiting in the community right about that same time. So several people who had fought in World War I joined both. So some are members of the VFW and of the American Legion. And the American Legion never had an actual hall like the VFW did until recently, but they made the library their big project, and helped all along the way to keep that library funded. So you get to the new library, and inside, some things that were being changed. This is the opening tea that was held to celebrate the opening of the children's room. The children's collection was moved to the basement at that point in 1952. And it had all been freshly painted and decorated just for the kids. And I love this picture because, as I said, I grew up in the library. That's my mother, the first lady on the left. And I'm not sure who's next to her, but then Carol Johnson is the one wearing the corsage. And in case you miss it, the little girl in the corner on the left is me, eating a cookie, of course. I was 2, but that was probably one of my first major events at the library. The children's room to me was a magical place to grow up. I loved books. My sister taught me to read by the time I was 4 years old, and I've been reading ever since. And I credit the library with doing that, because we always had a great selection of books and programs that kept kids involved and enthusiastic about reading all along. One of the most important things that the library did in those years was Christmas. This is the famous fireplace upstairs in the library with 2 Christmas trees that went up every year. There was usually a fire burning in the fireplace during the winter months. And I can't remember anything more thrilling as a kid than the days when the Christmas collection would come out and be displayed on a table for the first time that season. Now, some of those books I may have read 5 times already, but getting them back every holiday season and just curling up by the fire and reading those Christmas stories over and over was definitely a special memory. That stayed true throughout all of the development years of the library. These kids are in front of the fireplace, I'm going to guess in about 1970. And when we were doing some library surveys and questionnaires over the last couple of years, so many people shared memories of growing up in South St. Paul and how the library became the place where they loved to go the most. I, for one, was one of those kids. I can't think of a better summer day than getting up and riding my bike to the library and coming home with 5 or 6 new books that I hadn't read before, and then just reading. And I was fortunate. My mother let me read. I didn't have to do dusting or clean the house, or, if I was reading, she figured that was exactly what I should be doing. So reading was always a passion of mine. And I loved the library that had those books. Now, just some little facts that some people may not remember. Just in 1948, the hours the library was open were Monday through Thursday from noon to 8 p.m. and Friday and Saturday from noon to 6. So there weren't really any mornings. And what's interesting too, the book return was outside at the top of the big staircase. So Elva was telling me that when the book return was overflowing, which it did all the time, especially over a weekend, and if it started to rain or snow, the police would call her and she'd have to come down and unlock the door, unload the book return box, and make sure it was empty enough for people to continue to use. And she lived in West St. Paul, so it was a trek to come down in the snowstorm and take care of the books, but that's what the directors were expected to do. Those big front steps led to the only entrance to the library on the upper level. There was one door in the basement that led out to the back, but that wasn't really used by the public. So you had to come in the steps at the front door. And then when you got inside, there was a landing, and you either went up to the adult section upstairs or to the children's room downstairs. The only restrooms were on either side of the door upstairs, women on one side, men on the other, and they're still in use. I was surprised to find out that wedding receptions and other events were often held in the library. You'd say in the paper that so-and-so had their wedding reception in the library children's room. So that became a popular thing to do. And I think we were trying to remember, there was like a kit, I want to say a kitchenette, but I think, I'm not sure it was that extensive, but apparently you could have a wedding reception downstairs much easier than up, because this little room in the basement had either a hot plate or some kind of running water, something that a caterer could use to make coffee and serve refreshments in. And then there was this door leading out that back little room in the library, and it led out to the back of the building where the Man McKay high rise is today. I mean, that direction. There wasn't any parking lot, there wasn't any parking indication, but that's where staff would park, is you could park in back of the library and the public would park on the street. So we had, back up here again. Sorry, I want to go. What did they do? Oh, well. I don't know what happened there, but I'll get back to here in a second. It's kind of amazing that in 100 years, we've only had 12 directors or head librarians, and they're an impressive roster. A couple only stayed a couple years. Others had much longer tenure with the library. We've already mentioned that Ms. Pleister stayed till 1925 and then went to manage a library in Seattle, Washington. Grace Dorival stayed till 1946. Marie Knudsen was here for a couple of years after the war in 1948. Alice Lewis stayed for a year in 48 and 49. Doris Nordenskjold was here in 49 to 51. Then Dorothy Jorstad came. I went to work under Dorothy at that point. It was 1951 to 1962. My sister Elva took over in 1962 to 73. Then the first and only gentleman to ever serve as director of the library, Paul LaRue, was here for 5 years from 73 to 78. Then Alice Jones, who had worked at the library as a secretary in the 1940s, actually came back and served with Carol Johnson as co-director from 1978 to 83. Then Carol took over from 83 to 96. Jane Kroschel was here from 96 to 2010. And Kathy Hallgren, today's director, started in 2011. Remember, I was talking about family at the beginning. Some of you may not know that Carol Johnson and Elva, my sister Elva, and I are cousins. So Carol and Elva had gone to high school together, graduated together from there. Carol went to Hamlin and Elva went to the U for undergrad. And then they both graduated from library school at the University of Minnesota. So they were working together and had known each other all their lives. Dorothy was here for the initial conversations and plans for the library edition, but her husband was a stockyards executive and he got transferred to Chicago. So she took a job at the library at the University of Illinois when she left in 62. And then Elva took over, but her husband got a new position with Honeywell in 1973. And they lived all around the world as field service personnel for the company until 1987. They currently live in South St. Paul, and Elva visits the library quite often. Alice Jones and Carol Johnson held the spot from 1978 to 83. Now, I couldn't find a picture of Alice, but I worked with her. And her husband, Fred Jones, is pictured here trying out a new magnifying lens reader, which the Lions Club had donated to the library. And I put him in here because Fred Jones was my history teacher in high school. And I credit him a lot with my passion for history. He's just a wonderful teacher. And I don't know how many of you know that their daughter, Nancy Schoweiler, was a Dakota County Commissioner from 1998 to 2016. So again, family always played an important part in leadership in this community and from library leadership. And Carol and her husband raised 4 children in South St. Paul. She retired in 1996 after 53 years with the library and still has her home in South St. Paul. She was children's librarian for many of those years, and her story hours were memorable. I mean, she would dress up in costumes, and the kids loved Carol, and anybody can still remember that. A couple of our other directors, Jane Crochel was here till 2010, and then Kathy started in 2011. And of course, it's under both of them that so many challenges and accomplishments, achievements happened at the South St. Paul Library as libraries in general begin to change and expand their mission into so many different programs. So they've certainly made a memorable contribution. Programs started from the very beginning in the library. So way back when we were in the Fitzgerald building on Grand Avenue, one of the first story hours happened in April of 1923, and it was called Children as the Doll Hour. So if you were 12 years old or under, you could bring your doll to story hour at that point. This other one is of Carol, as I mentioned, doing a Halloween story time on the left, and the kids coming in costume. The first summer reading club started happening as well in the 1920s. And it's always been tremendously popular. This little clipping is from 1959, and kids read 2,100 books in 6 weeks as part of that program. That was 270 youngsters who took part in the summer reading program. The reading program always ended with prizes and a party for the kids. It was a big event, and again, one of those memorable things that so encouraged interest and enthusiasm about reading to our community's children. Also in 1987, the library began delivering books to shut-ins. And today, Honora is the librarian on wheels, as well as being our host tonight. So another great program that's been initiated at the library. This one made me smile. The very first copy machine that could be used by the public came in November of 1966, and it warranted a picture in the paper along with the new record case where you could check out LPs. This prompts me to mention most of these articles are from the South St. Paul Daily Reporter, which was one of our papers in the 50s and 60s, started way back in the 1800s. But during these development years of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, we actually had 2 weekly papers, sometimes 3, just for South St. Paul. The South St. Paul Daily Reporter came out twice, once in the morning edition and the evening edition. And then we had the South St. Paul Sun Current and the Southwest Review. So I enjoyed the privilege of having 3 papers active in the community when I was Centennial Coordinator in 1987. And everything you did in town was covered quickly and easily by the papers. They were always vying for stories and news. So that's why the new copy machine and a record case could get a photo in the paper. Of course, now that's all changed. There is no more Southwest Review, no more Sun newspaper, and the Reporter is long gone. So now we have one paper, the South St. Paul Voice, which is a monthly and does a great job of covering local news. But of course, with the monthly edition, it's not always current. So we have to rely a great deal on the internet and Facebook to keep us up to date. In 1970, a whole new program started, and that was to lend out framed artwork. And this was an interesting process that we actually, I say we, meaning the library, got 45 framed reproductions of artwork by famous artists from all over the world, and with a variety of subjects and sample styles. And they were big. These were huge pictures. So they were all displayed on the top shelf of the bookshelves around the new edition, the shelves down there, and the children's room, and the basement even. So you could walk through the library and find something you liked, and then the library pages would carefully pack it up for you in a case, and you could have it for 6 weeks in your home. So the collection got to be very well known by people, and they'd request items way in advance for special events that they were having at their home. Just another expanded program for the library. And then, of course, there was the bookmobile, which came out in 1961, and Hazel Braithwaite was the bookmobile librarian. And once again, I have to tell you some family connections. I don't know if I mentioned that my mom worked at the library. My sister obviously worked at the library. I worked at the library from 1964 until 1972. And my niece, Ray Marie Triscoe, worked at the library, and then eventually went on to serve as president of the South St. Paul School Board and president of the South St. Paul Library Board most recently. And it just so happened that Hazel Braithwaite is the mother of my sister-in-law, Joan Glewwe. So it was definitely still in the family. She was raised grandma, and you know, certainly well-known tale, but not because she was Joan's mom. I worked the bookmobile on Tuesdays after school from Jefferson School. The parking lot on 21st, and the bookmobile would pull in there. If you're too young to remember it, it really was bookmobiles are very popular all over the country during this point. So most libraries developed some kind of bookmobile program. And part of that was because the schools gradually were reducing their own library collections. You know, grade schools didn't have libraries after the 1960s. So neighborhood kids, and I had to laugh at the caption on this newspaper photo, said you can come casual. This woman has curlers in her hair when she went to the bookmobile to pick up her books. It was very casual and it was fun, and the kids would line up and wait for the bookmobile to arrive. And Hazel spent hours each week picking out new novels for fiction selections for the library, always knowing which neighbors in her area that she was headed to liked which authors, and she gave them very personal service. So the bookmobile was used until 1994. Now, the 1965 addition to the library was, of course, a major improvement. And at that point, and I remember these days because I started there in '64, reshelving books was a challenge, to say the least. I mean, you can see Marlene Youngworth here on this ladder, having to put books on the top of the library shelves where the public couldn't even see them, much less access them. But we would pile books on top of books, trying to accommodate all the thousands of volumes in the collection at that point. So it was the 1957 board that was really spearheading the 1965 edition. And again, some who's who people on here. Second from the left is Carol Matras. Carol was president of the Polish National Alliance. And then we have Dolores Bodwin. She was the wife of Judge Irving Bodwin. Clemens Ferdine was the principal at the high school. And Al Blumenfeld owned Blumenfeld's Clothing, and he is there with Mrs. Foote presenting the library board with a check from the American Legion, which continued to support the library throughout its history. Dorothy Jorstad had worked with the library board and city staff while the plans and the architect had been selected. Elva inherited those plans, and she's pictured there with Elaine Cullen, longtime library cataloger. And of course, it was interesting, Ellerby Architects, who'd done the 1927 building, was the architect for the 1965 edition as well. And if you take a look at you can see how thoughtful the addition was. I mean, the windows were designed to echo the shape of the windows in the 1927 library. There was lots of light, lots of sunlight in both areas. It was designed of the same color brick so that it looked like it matched one, came into one building. And it was dedicated on April 25th, 1965. Just some things about this new edition then. And the picture behind Honora today is this picture from the paper, which the library was celebrating its golden anniversary on December 1st. At that point, the children's library had moved upstairs. The teen or young adult books were on the mezzanine on the west side, and the nonfiction collection was moved to the mezzanine on the east side. Adult bios and fiction were on the main floor, and reference books were in the basement, except for what looks like reference books right here in the front of this slide, in those bookshelves. It's like encyclopedias or reference books. Trying to think what I should miss here. In 1980, there were some additional improvements and renovations made to the 1927 building in particular. And there's an article in the paper about Carol Johnson being happy because she could finally open the big windows upstairs in the children's section. So let those summer breezes in. In the photo, though, you can see the rack to offer LPs, so you could pick out your record albums. The card catalog must be further in than we can see, but the card catalog, of course, was huge. And this looks like the magazine and reading room section is still in the same place where it used to be. And you can get a sense of the openness and the space that was being enjoyed in the 1965 edition. Some of the major changes were that in the big old front entrance was closed forever. Part of the reason was that they couldn't manage having people checking out books on two different locations. It was too easy for people to leave without checking out. So, you could be carrying your books around and say, oh, I checked out downstairs, and then go out the main door. So that was all blocked off. In 1963 was the first reciprocal borrowing pact between Dakota Scott Library and South St. Paul. Just a quick reminder, the Dakota Scott Library was actually located in Menard's parking lot in the back, like where you'd go to pick up lumber, on Emerson, right tucked in there. And so we were able to borrow books from them, and their people able to borrow from us starting in 1963. In 1970, the South St. Paul Library became an official affiliate of the Dakota County Library System. In 1985, preparation was made to automate that system. And in 1986, South St. Paul cardholders could borrow through any Minnesota library reciprocal borrowing compact. The Dynex system was operational in November. And in 1989, the first computers were purchased for public access. The 1980 Library Board also was a prestigious roster of individuals. We've got Barry Cosgrove, Cindy Peth, John Hampy, Betty Bartle, and Bill Frankham. And in the front row, Ollie Rivard, Patrick Dehaney, Margaret Bateman, and Lucy Krachowski. And they were really responsible for many of the more modern changes to library operations that you see. Now, history wouldn't be history without some unusual events. And one of those happened in 1993 when Gary Lapps, also known as Gary Parker and also as Richard Carey, was arrested by South St. Paul police. turns out he had taken nearly 30,000 books from area libraries. And South St. Paul librarians were the ones that found out about him. He used to come into the library about twice a week. He would maybe check out one book under one of those assumed names. One of his library cards were in his real name. When the police, so the South St. Paul library staff planted a plant of a science fiction book that they thought he might want to take, and he did. And they immediately called the police, and he was found with 408 books in his car, and then between 22 and 27,000 books in his storage locker. He'd been stealing books for over 10 years. So this was a strange way to make the papers, but South St. Paul made all the papers because of this situation. He never served jail time, but he was placed on 10 years probation, not allowed in the library for 2 years, and he had to pay all the fines on 30,000 bucks being overdue. So it also turns out he had made himself a withdrawn stamp. And so some of these books he'd actually stamped on it withdrawn as though it had been removed from the library collection when they weren't withdrawn at all. Another article, this is kind of interesting to me. In a couple of years ago, I was doing research for the October edition of the South St. Paul Voice, and I'd had several people tell me stories about haunted houses and places in South St. Paul. And one of the ones that was always mentioned was the library. So I found this article from 1974, and it was kind of interesting that librarians were accommodating all these people who had an interest in the supernatural and witchcraft. So some of the books were the coffee table book of witchcraft and demonology, the book of vampires, and the book of werewolves. And just kind of an interesting assortment. But it got me to thinking, and on September 16th, 2011, the Hastings Paranormal team had called in to set up a program at the South St. Paul Library, a public program. And so they stayed overnight in the library on September 16th, and they reported having two spirits. One was a woman who worked children. My screen says Zoom closed unexpectedly.
I still see you, Lois. Do you want to try to share your screen again?
Yeah, let's do that.
Here we go. Back in business.
No, we've got to get to the show though. Okay. Anyway, I have no trouble believing that the woman who worked at the library in the 1940s was Alice Jones. If you knew Alice, she loved it here. She's probably still wandering around. I don't know about the young boy. No bad spirits were ever found, I will say, just a couple of residents haunting one of their favorite places. However, I will tell you, when I was in college, so after I didn't work at the library regularly, I lived on campus. But I would often come to South St. Paul on Sundays to sing in my old church choir. And then I had a key to the library, and on Sunday afternoons, I would come in and type catalog cards. That was my job by that point, was typing the catalog cards. And the library can be a pretty spooky place when you're here on a dark evening alone. It's an old building that makes a lot of noise. I remember several times thinking, I think I'll just leave now. Never too many hiding places, but never in a bad way. Library staff has always been amazing. This group is from my era when we were in high school together. The photo is actually from a reunion that was held several years later. And this includes Shirley Goodell, Helen Fisher, Cindy Smith, Gretchen Kaufman, and Sandy Novak. Library pages were the backbone of the library, as they still are. And some of the things that we did, I made a list of them. first of all, I was paid 75 cents an hour in 1964 when I started. And pages would come in after school, and the main job was to reshelve books. As books were returned during the day, the librarians would check them in and then pile them on a book cart, and then you'd come in after school and organize the book cart so you could deliver books back to the shelving where they belong. They also served patrons, helped with research questions. The most fun, though, was when you were assigned to the workroom to fix books, whether they were torn pages or needed a new plastic cover or a new binding. And of course, then we'd all gather in the basement and laugh all Saturday afternoon while we mended books. Just a great memory of a lot of friends. And then when I was there, I did all the exhibit windows. My sister had me do all of the windows inside the front entrance there for different holidays and seasons and topics. Just some more familiar faces. Everybody knew Ione, of course. She was at the library for 46 years. Just retired a couple years ago. And then Barbara took over the bookmobile after Hazel retired. And she's actually, this photo was actually taken when they were examining the books that had been stolen from libraries and trying to figure out which ones belonged to South St. Paul. And then we had Susan, of course, who was working with the children, and Diane, who was the senior information clerk for many years. And this one made me laugh. So Sarah and Tracy promoting books on birds. And the reason I had to smile was the first children's bird watch for the South St. Paul Library was held in April of 1923. The kids were encouraged to write down every bird they saw. So birding has apparently been an important part of library promotion. And then, of course, from the 1950s to the 1980s, if you were working on a Saturday and over lunch or on an evening when the library was open and you got a supper break, everybody would head to the Tasty Freeze, which was on the corner of Marie and 2nd Avenue. And they had the best foot-long hot dogs. I can still taste them. And they had two-tone soft serve cones. You could get chocolate and vanilla in one cone. Great shakes and malts, and it was definitely a dieter's downfall, but most of our meals came from the Tasty Freeze. It was torn down when the high rises started needing more parking in the 1980s. But staff has always had fun. This is a couple of photos I grabbed. One was from the 2019 Kaposia Days Parade, and the other one was when the staff dressed up in 2018 for Halloween. But it's been a tradition, certainly as long as I've been around, that the library's always had great staff Christmas parties, usually a potluck. Ours used to be lunches. So we'd have everything from hot dish to Christmas cookies. And even if you weren't working that day, you certainly didn't miss the library Christmas party. Just the camaraderie and the friendships that were formed by working together has always been memorable. It was also interesting during the process of petitions and surveys that were done in the last few years, many people mentioned their favorite part of the library is the staff, that they are the kindest, most patient and helpful people and always cheerful. And I can attest to that as well. I've been in the library several times when a challenging situation or an individual who needs special help was, came into the library and the attention given was so kind and so patient. So certainly well known for our wonderful staff. So as we start to wrap up, we have to talk about the ending of the first 100 years and the beginning of the next 100. And I'm not going to get into all the discussion that's gone on in the last couple of years, but in 2017, the city hired architects who came up with this possible design for the city on the current location. So you can see the 1927 building is intact. The 1965 building is gone and the entrance renovated and an entirely new back addition added. And this plan was a 2017 possibility and certainly seemed to suggest some positive things to many people. but it turned out that it just wasn't big enough to handle what had to be handled. So in May of 2021, after again several events, I did a petition booth at South St. Paul Kaposia Days in 2019 that just asked people whether they wanted to save the library, and then on the road again in October of 2019, handed out surveys by the city, and then in January of 2020. The citywide survey was mailed out to everyone, asking them what they felt were the important needs for the library, and offering several plans, possible options, and lots of meetings. I went to my first meeting on the subject in February of 2018. And of course, the meetings are still going on. But in May of 2021, the city voted to support Dakota County taking over the South St. Paul Library and building a new library for $8.3 million on 7th and Marie Avenues. And I did have to kind of smile though while I was going through these articles. When the 1965 edition was approved, right after that, they started talking about design plans. And a group of people came to the city council at a meeting and said they didn't want the library on 3rd and Marie. They wanted it on 6th Avenue North by the high school. So now that many years later, we're going to end up on 7th Avenue by the high school. But their rationale was, and this made me smile, there was so much traffic on 3rd Avenue and Marie that children would never be able to cross the street safely to get to the library. So that was their concern about that location. However, as you know, the library board stuck to their plans, and the library was built on donated land by the Stockyards Company. So this adoption in May of 2021, it had been 52 years since South St. Paul had been discussing turning the library over to management by Dakota County. And it's finally going to happen as we move forward now. And South St. Paul will be a fully Dakota County library. The new library, this is one of the conceptual plans for the new library that'll be on 7th and Marie by the high school. And it's coming in at $8.3 million. And you'll, of course, everyone in the city will be hearing more about it as plans move forward. So we have to say goodbye to our library. No one knows what will happen to the existing buildings. The 1927 building is in need of quite a bit of renovation. I've heard estimates as high as over $3 million. So we don't quite know what will happen there. I just had to put this photo in because I hope Lucy gets to go to the new location. She's always been a favorite of mine. So I personally am kind of leading a group that is interested in doing applying for a legacy grant from the Minnesota Historical Society next year to have an evaluation done of the 1927 building at least and see if it can be placed on the National Register. That won't prevent it from being demolished. You can always demolish a building if you're the city. But it might add some incentive to a nonprofit or a business who's interested in preserving historic properties, who might be able to spend the kind of money that's needed to bring it back to where it can be fully operational again. So I want to thank Kenora for her help. She's been my liaison for the last several weeks, and I kept bugging her for more photos and more stories. And fortunately, during the pandemic, one of the staff people assembled this wonderful file of newspaper clippings, starting in 1921 all the way through the present day. And that was hugely helpful because I would never have had the time to find all of those at the Dakota County Historical Society. But I do want to thank Rebecca next door at the Historical Society for all the photo reproductions, and to Town Square Television for broadcasting tonight's program. And then, of course, the century of library lovers who have made this history such a special story. And I think that's the one thing I am sure of, no matter what happens to the current library buildings, the people of this community love their library. And it's been an important part of the story. It will continue to be an important part of the story. And especially for South St. Paul kids who've always loved their library. So thank you for coming tonight, and we'll see if you have any questions in the chat.
Thank you so much, Lois. I learned a lot, and that was excellent. I have one question that came in early on about the original library on Grand. Did the collection and magazines include items in other languages to reflect the community?
No, that was a good question, but no, it didn't. Like I said, the Polish Hall had their own library. A couple of newspapers came from Central and Eastern Europe, and of course they were in the language of that country. But there was no real effort made to add to the collections in other languages at that point.
The library now does have a Spanish collection that we maintain. Any other questions that anybody has, they can throw in the chat. We'll wait a couple minutes. Or Lois, you just covered everything.
Well, I didn't though. The thing is, there's so many more people, so many more things that happen. Couple that I thought of, I didn't find a date for it, but I wondered when audiobooks first made an appearance, because that's a huge collection now. And when large print books came out, because that was a new thing too for seniors, having large print. And of course, both of those are very popular collections at the library. And then adding movies and CDs was also developed in the 1990s. And of course, I've learned a great deal through these past few years about how libraries themselves have changed. And our library is no exception to the expansion of programs that are specifically designed to help people in our community, to help people with special needs, to certainly be accessible at all levels and for everyone. And just expanding program space and collections, and it's all a challenge, but it's really something that I know Kathy and the staff have been addressing along with the school board, or with the library board. And that board was very active too in the development of the current plans. I did ask my sister, because I know Kathy spends a lot of time at City Hall and meeting with city staff. And so I asked my sister if she had to go to council meetings and present the budget, or this, so she was there in the 60s and 70s. And she did not. At that point, the library board handled everything. So she had no direct contact, direct contact in terms of the budget process or personnel. That was handled by the board, which I thought was kind of an interesting development.
Well, thank you. Patty just said, thank you, Lois, for an interesting and informative presentation. Chris said, as a Dakota County user, she's found the obscure books come from South St. Paul, and she loves the fact that we keep the older books that she remembers from her youth. This might be a little more in-depth discussion, but if the library could be renovated, would this space work to move the museum? I'd hate to abandon such a beautiful building. And that's, we do on our website have a section about this whole process and all the different ideas that were brought up through these years. So if you want to check that out, just go to ssplibrary.org and you can kind of learn about the ideas that were presented. Any other?
Just mentioning the museum, the museum is closed right now to the public for renovation. So through this process, we'd also heard that the museum might be closed and moved. But instead, the Dakota County Commissioners voted to do extensive renovations. So the museum will stay in South St. Paul for the near future anyway. So, but that was definitely one of the first proposals, was to combine the two operations into one facility.
And current library director Kathy Hallgren said, thank you, Lois, for telling our history in such a wonderful way. And I agree. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions come through, so I'd like to get out of here. I'm in the basement that's haunted. Lois mentioned that scary feeling when you're in here alone. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us at the library. Lois is on social media and pretty easy to contact. Sarah Connolly, the children's librarian's upstairs in the haunted upstairs.
Thank you again so much. This has been really.
Thank you. You did a lot of hard work. We really appreciate it. So thank you all for coming. Have a great night and join in more of our celebrations throughout the year. See you later.
Thanks. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.